And these people are condemned on their own merit. So they're responsible for their own sin. They're not predestined to hell. And even though those people, even though it says that God hardens their heart here, or it says about Pharaoh, what they would say is God really just turns them over to their sin. So God says, okay, like you want to turn away from me, you want to sin, you want to be in opposition to me, that's fine. I will remove my limiting on your sin from you and just turn you over to your sin. And they use that. They say that even though Pharaoh is referenced here as someone that God hardens his heart, in the Old Testament, when we read the Pharaoh story, there are several times where it says Pharaoh hardened his own heart. There's a point at which God just eventually says, according to the covenants, "Hey, I've now I've let you go far enough where there's no turning back. You've made your decision." And what's interesting is all three theologies pretty much agree on this interpretation of that first part. It says he has mercy on whom he wills, and he hardens whomever he wills. Everybody pretty much says God's not responsible for the hardening. What's really talking about here is God turning them over to their sin, which is consistent with the rest of Romans, since that's what it says in Romans 1 and 2. So far, no problems. The problem comes when we talk about the concept of election for the saints. And what a Calvinist will read this passage to say is that God's elect, those who he has chosen to save, he shows mercy to those people, and those people only. He chooses them out from the amount of humanity, and specifically says to them, "I'm going to save you because you're one of my elect, and everybody else, I'm going to leave and not and not show mercy to." That's where they come up with limited atonement. So total depravity, nobody can save themselves. Limited atonement, only the elect are going to be saved. Unconditional election. The elect are elect and saved, not based on anything they do or any intrinsic quality on them. It's simply because God elects them for his glory. And then they say that may sound unfair, but that's where the passage about the potter comes in, right? Why does he still find fault? Who can resist his will? But who are you, O man, verse 20, to answer back to God? Will what is molded say to its molder, "Why have you made me like this?" Has the potter no right over the clay to make out of the same lump one vessel for honorable use and another for dishonorable use? What if God, desiring to show his wrath, to make known his power, has endured with much patience vessels of wrath prepared for destruction, in order to make known the riches of glory for vessels of mercy, which he has prepared beforehand for glory? So what a Calvinist would say is, okay, see, God's merciful by saving everybody was destined for wrath, and God's merciful by saving some. Just because he chooses not to save everyone does not make him unmerciful.
Corey, mobile.
They say we cannot sit in judgment over God, is what that potter part is saying. And it's easier to understand when we understand human fallenness. God's not condemning anyone to hell, they would argue. He's just saving some. So, so they'd say, a quote from one of them is, election and reprobation are related. Election being the people who are saved, reprobation being the people who are condemned on their own merit. But they are not parallel in every way. In electing children of Adam for salvation and making them vessels for mercy, the Lord overcomes the fallenness of the clay. In reprobation, he confirms this fallenness. So, for the people who are saved, it shows that he's merciful because he overcomes the fallenness. People who are not, and who he just leaves to their sin, it shows his justice by judging the fallenness. Two other examples I want to read for you. So I need to pull them up here. Oh, I was missing a tab in my My tabs here. So they would admit that this is a difficult concept to understand. Timothy Keller, who is a Calvinist, but often around here, says election and reprobation, reprobation being human depravity, human sinfulness, are deep truths that defy our attempts to grasp them fully. God has told us some things about his purpose in election and reprobation, but he has not answered every question we have. In cases like these, John Calvin says that a mystery which our minds cannot comprehend ought to be reverently adored. Let us reverence the Lord for his love and justice shown in election or reprobation, even though we cannot understand these doctrines completely. I apologize, I misquoted that. That is from R.C. Sproul, not Timothy Keller.
Ooh, okay. Yes, R.C. Sproul is definitely a Calvinist.
Yes. Timothy Keller is as well,
Yes.
and these next pieces come from his commentary supporting R.C. Sproul's views on this. One is John Stott's quote. So Timothy Keller says, in summary, in election, God comes in, softens our heart, and makes us good. In hardening, God simply passes over and lets people have the way they have chosen. In John Stott's words, if anyone is lost, the blame is theirs. But if anybody is saved, the credit is God's. This autonomy, contains a mystery which our present knowledge cannot solve, but it is consistent with Scripture, history, and experience. Okay, then he goes on to give one other illustration. So they're admitting that this is a difficult truth, but they're saying, hey, man's free will is involved when it's condemning him, but God's sovereignty is involved when it comes to saving man or human. Goes on to give an illustration that gets away from all this academic theological language and just makes it more clear. So this is Timothy Keller quoting Dr. James Kennedy with this illustration. Here are 5 people who are planning to hold up a bank. They are friends of mine. I find out about it and I plead with them. I beg them not to do so. Finally, they push me out of the way and they start out. I tackle one of the men and wrestle him to the ground. The others go ahead, rob the bank, kill a guard, and are captured, convicted, and sentenced. The one man who was not involved in the robbery goes free. Now I ask you this question. Whose fault was it that the other man died? The other man died. Turn the page. Now, this other man who was walking around free, can he say, because my heart is so good, I am a free man? The only reason that he is free is because of me, because I restrained him. So those who go to hell have no one to blame but themselves. Those who go to heaven have no one to praise but Jesus Christ. Thus, we see that the salvation is all of grace from its beginning to its end. All right, so
Kister left
they would
your
say
channel.
that predestination, then, which is a term we hear a lot about, is for the saved, not the condemned. The saved are predestined to heaven through election. The condemned go to hell based on their own free will. So do we? And that's the Calvinist view of this passage. So they say that this whole passage is talking about that election, the salvation of the election. Of the salvation of the elect. Wow, I can't speak tonight. Sorry, been up for a while, talked a lot of work. All right. Any questions or clarification points on that? Those of you Calvinists here, if I misinterpreted what I read about Calvinism, or misinterpreted your stance, please correct me. Please explain it better. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask them, and we'll try to answer them for you. We're getting there, Prod. Go ahead, Wash.
Wait, was that all 3, or was that just Calvinism?
That was just Calvinism.
It sounds like it contradicts itself.
How so?
It just sounded like you took the one point of predestination by choice and then another point of predestination by election.
Depends on which direction you're going, essentially.
Yeah, that is the Calvinist. The majority, there's different Calvinist doctrines, but the majority of Calvinists will tell you that people are saved they're predestined to be saved by God's election. And when they go to hell, it's because of their own choice. Their free will is involved in going to hell. God's will is involved in saving people. Read 3 Calvinist commentaries and all agreed on that point.
Sounds like you had a fun week.
Good times. Okay. Yes, they would say that. Agile foot. We'll get to the other schools of thought in this too. Okay, so we're gonna move on. As it doesn't look like there's a lot of other questions. Let's in the orange lights. But feel free to circle back at the end and ask more questions about this once we see how they interact. Okay. Next school of thought is on this passage is the Arminian view. Okay. So most Arminians will concede that this passage is most likely talking about election. But what they will say is, and I know that there's someone in this channel who will definitely call me out if I get this stuff wrong. So feel free to turn your light orange, SP, at any time. What they will most likely say is that this is a passage talking about... Go ahead, SP.
I'm just kidding.
They'll say that this is a passage talking about national election, not individual election. Election of vocation, not election of salvation. And how they will say that is that the doctrine of individual election, of God only choosing to save some people and give the opportunity for salvation to some people. Stick on the limited atonement part. The atonement is only for the people that God chooses. Their sticking point. So I'll say that contradicts several other verses in the Bible. Arguably, the rest of the New Testament is what most of them will say. So I picked out some of those verses. I'm going to read through them. I picked out 3 that they fall back on a lot. And feel free to double check me. I'm not going to post all the links, but the first one is 1 John 4:8. That says, anyone who does not love, I can read, does not know God, because God is love. Okay. Second one is Romans 2, verse 10. Note also from the book of Romans. But glory and honor and peace for everyone who does good, the Jew first and also the Greek. 1 Timothy 2:4. Who desires, talking about God, who desires all people to be saved, who desires all people to be saved and to come to the knowledge of the truth. Okay? So all these verses are talking about how there's no partiality. God loves all. And John 3:16, obviously. For God so loved the world that he sent his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have everlasting life. They say that those verses would tend to fly in the face of God only choosing a few who have an opportunity to be saved. One author put it this way: Jesus should be our definitive view of God, and everything else should submit to that. Therefore, something else must be going on in this passage, other than individual salvation. Somebody else, another Arminian author, said this: imagine you are reading an academic article and you're really having trouble following the author. You find yourself thinking, what's your point? In this situation, you might turn to the author's conclusion and find, so that's what he's getting at. That's what his argument is moving towards. If the author's conclusion contradicted what you had read in his preceding argument, you may rightly conclude that you had misunderstood what he had been saying, and you would be rereading the preceding arguments to find out how they fit and build towards that conclusion. So, what the Arminian would say is, okay, it may seem like this is talking about election, but it can't be talking about individual election because we know from the rest of the New Testament that God wants everyone to be saved. So if he's only going to select a few with the opportunity to do so, that seems to fly in the face of that. Therefore, there must be something else going on here. So, they would say that this passage is not talking about God's faithful, not talking about election of individuals, but his faithfulness to the nation and the election of the nation of Israel as a chosen people. So they're saying he's explaining to the Jews why the Gentiles now also are the people of God. And why the nation of Israel, like the political nation of Israel, is not necessarily the true Israel. The true Israel, God's people, is an Israel that's internal. Circumcision of the heart, as we'll see later. Inward condition, not an outward condition or a condition by birth. And that's what this passage is saying and defending. Therefore, God can choose whatever nation he feels like, and can make whoever he feels like his people. Can elect whoever he wants to be his people. It's also saying if it is talking about individual election, it says nothing about how God elects people. It could just be based on any number of reasons. It's not just saying that there's no reason. Just not what we're told it is. Okay, so basically what they're saying is, if it is talking about individual election, it's saying that it's not saying that there's no reason, like God just elects people willy-nilly. It just doesn't say what the reason is, if that makes any sense. It's a little bit hair-splitting, but yeah. So the thing, but most of them would just say this passage is talking about the election of vocation, election of nationhood, not individual people being destined for hell and destined for heaven. Yes, we will be talking about that, Agile. That's what we're going through. Going to give you different ways to read this passage. All right, so does that make sense? Go ahead, Dodge.
So the specifics there then is on the context of I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I have compassion on whom I have compassion. As far as whether that was individual or for a nation, you said?
Yeah. Yep, they would say it's talking more about God kind of transferring the mantle of responsibility of being his people from specifically the Jews to now Gentiles and Jews, making it whoever believes. Yep. So God has the right to transfer, the ability to be his people wherever he wants to transfer it.
Is it okay if I poke at that for a moment, or is it something that is just we're going to go through what are the different specifics on the beliefs first?
No, go for it.
No, let's poke the bear.
All right. So I was looking around, and it looks like it was Exodus 33 where he said that to Moses. I figured it'd be good to look through there and see what is referenced in that area. And to me, I'm just gonna link it. I have no idea which version that was. I just kind of looked it up. That is. Oh, where was it? I just looked this up. Or where is it in here? Verse 19. But around there, it seems like it's speaking specifically to Moses, not even as the nation, but God saying he's going to do what he sees as appropriate as a response to Moses saying, please show me your glory, and God saying, no. Yeah, you cannot see my face.
Go ahead, SP.
I think I can speak to that a little bit. I'm not sure that it's necessary that it's talking about nations there, and I don't want to take Anger's thunder because I think he might be explaining this in the Catholic view, so I'll be as quiet as I can be. But I think that there's still room in that Exodus passage to allow for another perspective than just for it to be national. And I think Romans is actually talking about something slightly different than nationally as well.
Go for it then.
Okay. I won't speak long. And I'll be as concise as possible. But I think what we're really talking about in Romans 9 is Paul was saying that God has chosen to save through a different method than what the Jews had anticipated, right? The Jews kind of looked at election and said, hey, we're God's chosen people, so we are, in a sense, in the kingdom of God just because of what we were born into. And Paul's saying, no, we're children of God because of the faithfulness of Christ and his death on the cross. And through that, then, he has offered salvation to everyone in the world, the Jews and the Gentiles. And he actually goes on and explains this in much greater detail in future passages, not that I want to spoil it. So I think what Paul, speaking as an Arminian, I think I can say that confidently, I think what Paul is saying here from our perspective is that when the Jews are upset that God is, instead of using the national what's a good word for it? Genealogical view of salvation or his kingdom, he's using a different method, right? He's using faith. And in that sense, God's going to have mercy on who he has mercy and compassion on who he has compassion through the method, not necessarily through the individuals, if that makes sense.
So, okay. Actually, can I respond to that? I feel like I'm jumping into as my question, I guess.
Yeah, go ahead.
Alright. Alright, that makes sense. I think it is. Yeah, my oh, you're talking about Scribe, never mind. Yeah, with this, that definitely seems like it could definitely be a possibility. I had something in response, but I got distracted by the chat and I forgot it.
That's okay. If you want to put it in the chat too later, I can respond to it there too.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks for clarifying that. We're going to give Agile 1 sec here. Do you have something you wanted to add, Agile? Yeah, and that is something that all three views would really agree is something that's being talked about here is the danger of us sitting in judgment over God. Right. But there is a difference between sitting in judgment over God and trying to understand which one of these beliefs is most in keeping with the character of God.
Jack Yule joined your channel.
All right. So one more view that I'll summarize, and then we'll kind of just discuss all three and how they work together and what is perhaps keeping in the most with the character of Romans is the Catholic view of this passage. They would tend to lean more towards the Arminian way of looking at it as this is not talking about individual election to heaven and hell. Well, okay, I misspeak on that slightly. They would not. So they take a hybrid approach. They first take a look at the context of the quoted verses. So the potter over clay, they would argue, is a reference to Jeremiah 18, verses 6 and 10. What does that say? Take a look at verses 6 or 10. O house of Israel, can I not do with you as this potter has done, declares the Lord? Behold, like the clay in the potter's hand, so are you in my hand, O house of Israel. Okay. So far, so good. Lines up with the Calvinist interpretation of Romans. Verse 7. If at any time I declare concerning a nation or kingdom that I will pluck up and break down and destroy it. And if that nation, concerning which I have spoken, turns from its evil, I will relent of the disaster that I intended to do to it. And if at any time I declare concerning a nation or a kingdom that I will build and plant it, and if it does evil in my sight, I will not listen to my voice, then I will relent of my good which I intended to do of it. We'll post the link to that. So, that would seem to fly in the face of the Calvinist doctrine of election. What the Catholic would argue is that yes, the part about God giving people over to their sin is him just taking his hand off them, allowing them to go down the path that they chose. Lines up with the great divorce story that we're doing. Basically, he's saying, okay, your will be done. And then their heart is hardened. And they would argue that, yes, God chooses to save certain people, and yes, the grace that is required for salvation comes from God. However, their stipulation is that human free will is the thing that God uses to accomplish his election. They would say it's God's predestined plan for us to have a free will. If God predestines some to heaven and some to hell without utilizing their free choice, just like he did in the garden, giving Adam and Eve a choice as to serve him or not, it contradicts the rest of the Bible and the rest of Romans. So the method that God uses in his election is free will, people's responses to God. They said that lines up with the rest of Romans. That explains Romans 14 through 33, and it is consistent with the passage in Jeremiah that's being referenced about the potter and the clay. So they would say it's not a God's predestination versus free will. It's God's predestination using free will. Go ahead, Kessa.
That sounds a lot like what do they call it? Molinism? Is that the same or is it different?
I think. Go ahead, Andre.
I'm trying to remember if I might be getting my my definitions of Molinism and open theism crossed in my head. So go ahead.
My understanding of Molinism, and I might be way out of date on this, is that it is this idea of middle knowledge that God knows the free will that's going to be done to some great extent, and therefore plans his will around it. So I think it's similar to it. I would say though that Molinism would be a brand of that, and not necessarily. I wouldn't necessarily paint that Catholic perspective as Molinism, if that makes sense.
Although Molinism is a Jesuit perspective, so yeah, it's related. Yeah. But they would say that God knows in advance, yeah, so it's not open theism. I'm trying to go by terms and make sure I was getting them right. Alright, so those are the three views that I'm going to bring up tonight, because those are the three largest views, I would say. Most common views. This is something that has been argued in the church for a long, long, long time. Ever since Augustine. So, we're going to solve it tonight, in 4 minutes, before 9 o'clock. The open discussion, what do you guys think? What fits best with the character of Romans, the context, and these verses that we covered tonight? Go ahead, Dodge.
I guess I want to start off with each of these views. What do they think free will is? What is that defined as? Because it seems like they could all be talking about the same thing, just using different words and interpreting different parts as different parts of the process, such as the potter and the clay being at the beginning or at the end of the process. I think I just want some clarification on what the different views on what free will are.
Making people define terms. Good choice. The different schools would probably define it differently, but man's unhindered ability to choose right and wrong. That's how I would define free will. I think that they would all affirm that to some extent. The Calvinists would just say man can't choose right without God intervening and electing him. He can only choose wrong outside that. Which I personally would argue is a cop-out and not that man totally doesn't have free will then. But some Calvinists would disagree with me. Yes, and everybody would agree with that, Agile. All three views. Go ahead, Wingen.
Kind of think just something that you said, or the whole idea of apart from God, man will always make the wrong choice. Apart from God, this goes back to the whole idea of total depravity. It's not that apart from God, there is a right or wrong choice. It's just, we could make the right choice, but there's no redeeming the wrong choices apart from God. So I think in that regard, we've taken a very small view of things.
That's a good way of looking at it. Tessa and then Dodge.
It's easy to get cerebral about this, and like Scribe said, there's debates going on that don't seem like they're ever going to end, but I have family members who I pray for every day and have for years, and when it becomes personal, thinking about that they might go to hell, and knowing that if they do, knowing from being there and seeing that they were making those choices and making those choices and making those choices, it doesn't seem to matter as much which doctrine I need to pin that on. It's just a personal grief, and I think people can forget about that excitement of the debate.
Yeah, that's a good point. And that is honestly why we're kind of just lumping this debate into one night and moving past it, because I don't want to get too bogged down into the academic theology of Romans and move away from the applicable nature of it. But this is a debate that you guys will hear often in churches and schools and whatnot, so I figured we'd just at least give an overview of it tonight. Go ahead, Dodge.
Yeah, I think for me at least, the biggest thing here is actually redefinition for free will. Because my understanding of that whole argument previously was actually something more along the lines of your decision is not known before you make it, and cannot be known because you could make another decision the other way. Not necessarily on the specifics of that a decision, what's the word? That a decision can be evaluated.
So that's the whole your decision's not known until you make it thing is a different doctrine. That's open theism.
Yeah, Oh, go ahead.
And I would say that most respected Bible commentators would not believe that.
Yeah, and every I think that was probably the one I was first introduced to then, because that was whenever I hear about free will versus election, that's what comes to mind. So I think a lot of the framing for me, at least, has been quite different from what it actually means to other people. So I'm actually glad for that because once again, defining terms is important. Speaking of which, Kratos and Agilefoot, define your terms because you guys are talking about different things and you're using the same words. I'm pretty sure.
Ooh, you should probably let the two people talking figure that out then, right?
No, but I do want to commentate on one thing on what Dodge said before I move on to Thorfinn. That has been a criticism of, especially in the Calvinism versus Arminianism mix, is that neither side feels like they're accurately represented by the other side. Well, mostly Arminians don't feel like they're accurately represented by Calvinists. I just get the impression that Calvinists just don't care how Arminians
You're right.
represent them. Honestly, so I'm trying to be fair about that, but honestly, from my reading, that's the impression I got, was that most Arminians feel like Calvinists routinely misrepresent their position. And I know that that's something that we talked about last year when we did our talk about debating like a Christian. It's important to try and, before we discount something, give it its fair day in court. And the only way we can do that is if we allow those who are in that camp the chance to try to accurately represent their position. So, yeah, thanks, Dodge. Thanks for pulling that out. Go ahead, Thorfinn.
I guess through all my schooling, I've always thought about this subject and thought about that. Yes, we do have free will, but God has a plan that includes every one of us, and He has a plan for us. But we've always had the free will to choose God's plan or to not choose God's plan, and He knows what we're going to choose, obviously, because He exists outside of time. And so, but we have that choice. But in the end, my take on it is it doesn't matter because God is sovereign and He's on the throne, and none of this is really that consequential.
Yeah, thanks for that. I'm going to challenge you on one point. That it doesn't matter. A Calvinist would say yes.
Beat me to the punch. Okay. Okay.
An Arminian or a Catholic would argue that it does matter, because if all God has to do to save someone is put them on the elect list, and that grace is irresistible, then they would say that either God doesn't want to save everyone, which is arguably His right as creator, but that flies in the face of what He says elsewhere. God's will that any should perish, but all should come. So, and all can have the opportunity to be saved. So, if there isn't a free choice, that everybody has the opportunity to respond to God, and to turn to Him. If everybody does not have the opportunity, then they would say that God is being disingenuous. So it's important to have a doctrine that allows for people that allows for everyone to have the opportunity to turn and to be saved, not just an elect few, because that's consistent with God's character. So they would say it matters because of that. So yes, Arminians and Catholics would challenge that whole it doesn't really matter bit. Go ahead, Megan.
I think on another side point in the whole idea of it doesn't matter, I understand what you're saying, but there are a lot of consequences because, again, getting back to the idea of the whole elect list, I like the way you put that. This was a problem that a lot of that, like William Carey and a number of other people encountered early on in the missions movement. If Calvinism was true and all it took was to be put on God's elect list, then then why was missions necessary? These people would be saved, regardless of the actions of humans. We didn't have to do anything; they were going to be saved by divine intervention if need be. Although I guess you could say it is all divine intervention. But Hudson Taylor and William Carey and many others deemed it necessary to go and tell others because they believed that it might be that man's free will to choose to go to others was part of God's sovereignty. And so in that regard, there's a huge point of it does matter, because if we take a viewpoint that it's going to happen regardless of my action, then that has the potential to make us exceptionally lazy to a command of God in the Great Commission. So I think there's a lot of weight to it. So I understand what you're saying with it doesn't matter. It's not a point. It's not like a critical function of the core of Christianity. It's not part of, the gospel. It's not. You don't have to be on one, either a Calvinist or an Arminianist to be saved. But I think in the outer workings of Christianity and the spreading of the gospel, it is of incredible importance.
Yeah, that's a good point, Winged. I did some research on a guy named A.B. Simpson last week for a church project. A.B. Simpson is the founder of the Christian Missionary Alliance movement. Lady Unger actually grew up
left your channel.
In the Christian Missionary Alliance domination as a missionary. So something that's close to her heart. And I've got some disagreements with A.B. Simpson on theology, but I kind of did a research on his history to try and understand where he's coming from. Very interesting story. Was a Presbyterian Calvinist minister in a large city, large congregation, wanted to spend more money in missions and outreach to the poor in the city. And the church leadership basically said, if they're elect, they'll be saved. If they ain't, they won't be. Don't bother. And that is not, I don't want to paint all Calvinists with that brush, because that's not something most modern Calvinists believe, but that is arguably a danger of that theology. So A.B. Simpson broke away from that and made the Christian Missionary Alliance movement as a response to that, an attempt to try and draw more people into the fold by spreading the gospel by evangelism. Made me a lot more sympathetic to some of the things even I disagree with on him, because I realized he was perhaps just overreacting a little bit to some pretty hardcore hyper-Calvinism. Interesting study for myself. Sorry, go ahead. Whoever, I saw somebody had their light orange and then turned it back off again.
Don't be shy. It's just us.
This is usually a pretty light conversation, so you can be don't be afraid to say something wrong.
It's like you can come up. It's okay if you're wrong. Those of us that are right can correct you.
Exactly. You won't be able to make those of us who are right wrong. It's okay. Don't quote me on that. I'll soundboard that.
We'll respect you enough to tell you you're wrong.
I can almost hear Doctor typing up his notes on his little spreadsheet as we're making all these comments. I can hear the quotes just moving across the screen. I'm not repeating it.
It should be in the stream, Doctor.
There's no hashtag context in Doctor's notes. Okay.
No, there is not.
Check the stream.
We'll fix it in post. Anything else? Anything that you guys want to say, or any questions you have on this?
Yeah, this ain't easy, and I don't know anyone that's. I've yet to meet anyone that strictly adheres to one side of this argument or the other, like entirely. I come from someone that's, I don't know, I'm not a strict adherent or an extremist, I guess you would say. Like all the way to the left or all the way to the right or whichever direction you want to say. But I see validity in both Arminianism and Calvinism, but not so much to the exclusion of one or the other. Yeah, okay. Before tonight, I hadn't met anybody.
All right, go ahead, Dodge, and I got one last question for us to close out with.
I just want to point out that the scribe is also describing politics.
Oh. and look, there's a lot of controversy there. As I once heard someone put it, she said I was discussing politics, which I know nothing about, but that didn't keep me from having an opinion on it.
That right there is Facebook this week. Go ahead, SB.
Yeah. Just a couple things to summarize. I think it's interesting in these discussions because we had more than one of these at SOC as well. And it always amazes me that they're never as exciting as I think we anticipate them to be, which I think is a good thing. I think that the idea that this isn't an important issue is a bad one. I do think that it is an important issue. I think that it says a lot about the character of God, whichever side you fall on. And if you fall between, that also says something about the character of God. And that matters quite a bit. But at the same time, I do view these separate takes on this issue as non-essential. So still important, but non-essential. And it was Augustine who said that in the essentials, we need to have unity. In the non-essentials, we need to have diversity, and in all things, charity. So I think that it's good to have the different perspectives because they tend to balance each other in some way. At the same time, I think that if I could suggest one thing to those of you at the study tonight who are going to continue in the Roman study, consider this passage in terms of Paul speaking to the Jews as God has now brought in the Gentiles and made salvation about faith and not lineage as you go into the next couple chapters. I think when you see Romans 10 to 13 around there, and really what Paul has to say in terms of what Israel is going to become, this passage starts to look different. So that's just my perspective, my advice, and yeah.
So my final question was going to be, how do we apply this week? How does this academic discussion apply to our lives? But honestly, SB kind of stole what I was going to say with that. And that is that if we look at it through the Arminian perspective, or even the Catholic perspective, because they both dovetail on this point, that God is moving away from a lineage style of salvation. And to the Jews, that would be revolutionary.
Michael Fedor joined your
and what
channel.
he's saying is, look, I have the right to save people the way I want to save them. And the way that's in keeping with my character. And the way it's keeping with God's character is not judging people by externals. Not showing prejudice towards a race or a gender or a political group or a social class.
Joined your channel.
But in allowing everyone the opportunity to come to repentance with Him, and as soon as people judging people's value not in how they, perhaps even value is the wrong term, but treating people not differently, not based upon the externals, but upon their relationship with God and how they respond to God. That's what is God is saying is the criteria I'm going to use, and subverting the expectations of the Jewish audience that he's writing this to. So this week, when we look at the people around us, we ask ourselves, in what ways am I playing the potter? In what ways am I saying this person should be saved, that person is beyond salvation, this person's one of the elect, that person's not? In what ways am I playing God? And judging these people based upon who I think is worthy and is not, versus God's judgment. And God's judgment is not a judgment of political party or social class or race or gender, but it's a just judgment of how they respond to Him. So in what ways are we playing God and trying to be the potter this week, and are therefore treating our neighbors unlovingly? Well, we should just be loving them because of what God tells us to do, and because any one of them one day is either to be a creature of incalculable grace, like Lewis says, or of abject horror, based upon where they end up and the decisions they make in relation to God. That's all I had. If you guys have anything you want to add or questions you want to ask, go for it. And after a time of discussion, we'll close out in prayer. Trying to cop all the chat that happened while I was talking. I hereby deny your request, Wash. Doc and then Winged.
I have a question for Winged. Those Genesis 6 debates that you mentioned in the chat, will we ever get
No.
to those?
Nope.
We covered Genesis already. You missed your shot.
Been there, done that. Joke is, Winged and I disagree a little bit in the front of the Bible, a little bit in the back of the Bible, but we agree on pretty much everything in between. Go ahead,
Yeah,
Winged.
that's pretty much how it goes. But I wrote this in the text, but it's amazing to me, no matter how many times or where we go in the Bible and whatever studies we do, the idea of faith versus works just keeps popping up. The idea of a physical embodiment of a quote saved or righteous person versus someone who lives by faith. And we saw it in James, we saw it in Malachi, we saw it in Genesis, we're seeing it in Romans, and no matter where you go, it keeps coming up. And it's really very interesting to me that this is the amount of times that this is a subject and that this is an issue within the 66 books of the Bible tells me that this is a major issue that we as God's chosen people need to be very aware of. And I think it's something that we are incredibly susceptible to faltering in the and even the book study, the prodigal God, boy, did we hit it there. I mean, this just feels like something that's come up over and over and over and over and over. And I don't know if you guys are getting this impression, but it's like God saying, hey, pay attention. This is important. You need to get this. And I don't know. This is just me because I just when it's repeated this many times, you kind of get the feeling that God's, basically taking the Bible and just smacking into my forehead and it's like, I'm going to hold this here till you get it. He didn't quite put it like that, Agile, but that was the end of Romans 7.
Thorfinn the original left your channel.
Good stuff, guys. Last call. Anybody else before we close out in prayer?
I was just trying to back up what Scribe was saying. It shows a distinct difference, though.
Sorry, having mic problems. Yes, absolutely.
I mean, spiritual. You got your mortal and you got your spiritual, and like he says, it's just like God's holding that, the Bible up against his head and says, "I'm just going to show it. I hold it here until you get it." So it was, where. Oh, what's that old verse where it says, you cannot enter in heaven just off of works alone? I think, Scribe, that, we often get that mixed up. And we often get that into a routine, into a rut of, I'm going to go here, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this. But not putting the spiritual effort or growth or work in and just relying more on the physical. That's all I was just trying to reference to.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay.
Good. Okay. The struggle is real.
Wow, there's something really weird going on with my headset.
Yep, that's as good a sign as any that we need to close out.
It is indeed. All right. You're gonna get overdosed on vitamin C very quickly. That's
Darn right, man. It's like C.S. Lewis around here.
and half the time it's us quoting Keller quoting Lewis, so it's really confusing. Quoteception. Any other pro requests that we didn't get the first time around?